Chinese political culture is strange, to say the least. China has made unbelievably fast progress in almost every area of society in the past couple decades by basically every observable metric. But that isn't to say everyone in China is perfectly content with the country, or that other more abstract problems haven't appeared in recent times. Political repression and economic stagnation for the middle class have led to discontent and a nostalgia for China's recent past. China's advances have come at the cost of increased government oversight and meddling in the lives of its citizens, leading many to yearn for times of comparative freedom even if people were poor and the country was less developed during those times. One leader has come to embody and symbolize this spirit, that being Jiang Zemin. Jiang was a fascinating and unique person, both in his life and political career. Before we get into it, I'll mention that sources about Jiang Zemin tend to be pretty biased, either for or against him. There isn't a lot of neutral discussion like there is about someone like Deng Xiaoping or Hua Guofeng. It doesn't help that he was a decently controversial guy who only died recently. I've pulled from a lot of different sources and tried to follow the most cohesive and even-keeled narrative and stick to the facts as best I can. Jiang Zemin was born on August 17, 1926, in Yangzhou in eastern China to a large, generally well-off family. From a young age, he enjoyed reading and poetry and became a fan of French and Russian literature. His family wasn't very political, and he developed his early communist sympathies as part of student movements in Yangzhou. Part of what spurred his early political beliefs were the Japanese incursions into China throughout the 1930s. Chiang Kai-shek, the military dictator of China, saw the communist movement in the country as a bigger threat than the literal empire encroaching on his country. Famously, he said, "The Japanese are a disease of the skin, the communists are a disease of the heart." A few army officers arrested him in late 1936 and demanded he seek an alliance with the communists, which he eventually did. The most notable officer was the General Zhang Shiliang, who Jiang Zemin praised for this in an essay he wrote for a high school entrance exam in 1937. Also in 1937, Yangzhou fell to the Japanese. Yangzhou was spared much of the brutality characteristic of Japanese occupation, but Jiang and his family were still affected. He had to quit school, and many men in his family had been conscripted earlier and were away at war. School resumed in late 1939, now with the Japanese language as a required class. He apparently hated this class, which is a little strange for someone who would later go on to learn at least 5 languages. Jiang later stated his Japanese would have been better if he wasn't forced to learn it under a military occupation. He attended college in Nanjing in 1943, later transferring to a school in Shanghai, all still under Japanese occupation. Throughout his college years, he participated in many pro-communist protests against both the Japanese and later the nationalist government. He graduated in 1947 with a degree in electrical engineering. Jiang worked in various factories around Shanghai through the end of the 40s and early 50s, everything from an ice cream factory to a soap-making plant. After the People's Liberation Army gained control of the city in the midst of the Civil War, he also formally joined the Communist Party. He was made party secretary for various industries and factories throughout the Shanghai area, dealing with communicating between the government and the factories. In 1953, China set out to build their first automotive factory in Changchun with Soviet help. In 1954, Jiang was sent to Changchun to help with the construction efforts. He was selected to be one of 700 technicians sent to the Soviet Union to learn from an existing car factory in Moscow. He was enrolled in a language school in Changchun, where he quickly learned Russian. He spent most of 1955 and 56 in Moscow learning how to run a car plant. He returned to the Changchun plant in 1957, just in time for the first trucks to come off the line. He worked at the factory for 5 years until he could leverage a political connection, Wang Daohan, a friend from college, to get a job back in Shanghai as a director of an electronics research institute. One of his main objectives was to find international partners to help develop China's domestic electronics industry. As part of this, he was sent to Japan via Hong Kong. He was very impressed with both of these places and hoped to apply the principles that made them successful back home in China. He continued managing the research institute, generally unaffected by the chaos and upheaval of the Cultural Revolution and the 60s in China. Jiang got it better than many, but he still had quite the ordeal during these years. For his interest in foreign languages and literature, he was accused of being a supporter of foreigners and wanting to betray China. His ties with the Soviet Union didn't help either, since Sino-Soviet relations had completely collapsed by this point. Jiang was sent to a special school for political correction. The curriculum consisted of a year of intensive labor on a farm. He raised pigs and harvested wheat, eventually clearing all charges against him. He was deemed rehabilitated in 1970 and got a job in Beijing, working for the Foreign Affairs section of the Ministry of the Machine Industries, his first serious government position. China had a pretty short friends list in the early 70s, one of which was Romania, which was trying to distance themselves from the Soviet Union. To this end, they sent a request to China for technical assistance in constructing 15 machinery factories. Jiang Zemin was selected to lead the Chinese delegation and went through a course to learn Romanian. He spent 2 years in Romania, advising the Romanians on the construction and operations of their factories. He later said he enjoyed the trip and found Romania to be a welcoming place. Jiang's next major job was as part of a working group to restore order in Shanghai in the chaotic aftermath of Mao's death in 1976. Jiang's task was to repair and strengthen transportation and industry in the Shanghai area. His job mostly became firing people who had jobs they weren't qualified for that were making things inefficient. He kept this managerial job until 1979, when China made a major shift in establishing Special Economic Zones, or SEZs. This policy allowed for the promotion of many technically minded and politically savvy people, including Jiang, who was made vice minister of the whole SEZ project. He was also elected to the People's Political Consultative Conference, a governmental body in China that oversees many aspects of society that are outside the direct purview of the Communist Party. Jiang's task with the SEZs was to create economic growth while maintaining social stability and party control in the zones. The main source of economic growth would be foreign investment, and in 1980, Jiang headed a delegation that visited 12 countries in Asia, Europe, and North America. The trip was mostly unsuccessful, with no foreign countries or companies committing to anything. Jiang was still inspired by what he saw and remarked that Singapore and Ireland's free trade models could be applied to the SEZs. SEZs were still fairly unpopular at the highest levels of government, but he was able to narrowly secure support for the idea with a presentation he gave in front of the National People's Congress. The presentation was described as logical and humorous, leading Deng Xiaoping, the new leader of China, to vocalize his support for Jiang. Jiang was given conditional support to go ahead with his plans, and he was allowed to draft policy for the Xiamen Special Economic Zone, now making him one of the most important lawmakers in China. This job didn't last, and he lost it when the economic ministries of China were reorganized and consolidated in 1982. Thankfully for him, the government created the Ministry of the Electronics Industry shortly after, and he was made party secretary of the ministry after an interview with the Premier of China, Jiang Zemin. He was promoted to full minister just a short time later. He learned this while he was visiting America via a friend, hurriedly leaving a dinner party to call the embassy to confirm his promotion. This was during his 1983 visit to the US, where he met with various electronics and computer company executives, visited universities, and politicians. He even met with President Reagan briefly, where they exchanged jokes. Jiang reportedly asked Reagan why the US won't export many electronics and computers to China, to which Reagan responded that they were worried about them being used for military purposes. Jiang followed up by asking why the US was fine with exporting wheat to China. After all, China feeds their soldiers with it. Reagan reportedly laughed at this joke. After returning to China, he faced a difficult challenge in managing an electronics industry that was more than 10 years behind in most aspects. He somewhat successfully reorganized the industry, closing inefficient factories, modernizing the remaining ones, and integrating research better with manufacturing. After his visit to America, he knew how important computers would become and helped create some of China's first software development teams. His efforts led to an 8-fold increase in China's electronics production. Jiang worked to cultivate a good image of the reformed electronics industry, and maybe more importantly, a good image of himself. In one case, he visited Chen Yun, a respected elder statesman, with a printed circuit board and a microprocessor, using a microscope to show him the intricacies of their designs. The visit was reported on by the People's Daily, who highlighted it as an example of how foreign advancements in tech didn't have to clash with the country's domestic policies and goals. This was great for Jiang, a Western-minded politician who seemed to find more value outside the country than in it. He would have to constantly buoy his domestic reputation. Jiang did well in his position as Minister of Electronics, but the incessant power struggles and bureaucracy common in Chinese politics was beginning to wear on him, and he was looking for a more low-key assignment. Wang Daohan, his old political connection and friend, was mayor of Shanghai and wasn't doing a great job. Shanghai was only growing at about half the rate of the rest of the country, pretty bad for what is generally considered the financial capital of the country. Zhao Ziyang and Jiang Zemin visited Shanghai to talk with Wang Daohan about potentially replacing him. Wang Daohan wasn't happy with his job either, and an agreement was reached to replace him with Jiang in the near future. Jiang started his term as mayor with a press conference, taking questions from reporters instead of the traditional speech. He stated that Shanghai's modernization would be based around 3 pillars: infrastructure, foreign investment, and technology. Jiang was known at this time for his frequent casual visits to many areas of the city. He was known to stop random people on the street for their opinions on various problems in the city, and he even helped with work at the dockyards occasionally. He implemented free market reforms, as China was doing as a whole at the time, which led to some social instability. Prices had stayed basically the same for 30 years, and now they had increased by at least 20% for most items. This led to some minor protests, nothing too crazy, and Jiang was able to talk them down easily, but it was a sign of things to come. Jiang was successful in raising funds from international investors for improving the city, securing over $3 billion. Projects funded with the money included expanding the airport, metro system, and water infrastructure, as well as importing food from other regions to stabilize food prices. He even got to meet the Queen when she visited Shanghai in 1986, with Jiang personally overseeing her itinerary and organizing various events. Jiang met a lot of people as mayor, everyone from Deng Xiaoping and down pretty much. He gave a lot of attention to these visitors, in one case personally delivering a cake to an official who turned 80 years old precisely at midnight. Trust me, not even in the top 10 weirdest things Jiang did during his career. He got to meet and build a relationship with basically everyone in Chinese politics, since leaders during this time liked to escape Beijing winters in Shanghai. He got to spend a lot of time with Deng Xiaoping since he had a habit of visiting Shanghai every Chinese New Year. The latter half of the 80s would be a fairly trying time for the country, probably the biggest period of danger the Communist Party ever faced. Top leadership in the country was blindsided by major protests in Beijing in 1985, mainly against corrupt officials. Hu Yaobang, general secretary of the party at the time and one of the major proponents of Deng Xiaoping's reforms, hastily put out a statement supporting the protesters. Hu acknowledged and agreed with the protesters' concern, mainly the need for younger politicians and clamping down on corruption. Deng also gave Hu limited approval to try some of his envisioned political reforms. This whole debacle led to some fairly nasty top-level infighting in Beijing, which Jiang wanted to avoid in Shanghai, which was facing similar protests. Protests broke out at most of Shanghai's universities, including Jiang's former school. Jiang went to give a speech in front of these protesters, which turned into a 3-hour-long shouting match, culminating in Jiang reciting the Gettysburg Address in English to the students. It was just kind of a confusing ordeal, and neither side really understood what happened, if anything. He had a few private meetings with student leaders, none of which led to anything. Jiang refused to acquiesce to any of their demands, and later deployed unarmed police to break up their protests when they attempted to block major roads. This backfired, and thousands more were in the streets within a few days, prompting Jiang to ask for help and advice from Beijing. He was advised to meet with them again, but this, yet again, went nowhere. Factory workers also began joining the protest, prompting much attention to be given to the situation by Beijing. Incredibly luckily for Jiang, the protest died out after a few days, with no strong action needing to be taken. It's debated why this happened, but Jiang's sympathy towards student movements and his genuine desire for reform, albeit more limited than the students' demands, helped assuage their concerns. In Beijing at the same time, top leaders were making a decision that would totally never come back to bite them. Deng Xiaoping and Zhao Ziyang were in the process of removing Hu Yaobang from power for going too far with his political reforms. These reforms had led to an easing of tensions and the dispersal of most protests. Surely, this will have no consequences. Jiang had impressed top leaders with his relatively middle-of-the-road approach, not angering any particular group. Jiang made sure to quickly fall in line with the new party line, that being railing against the bourgeois liberalism of Hu Yaobang. He reinforced this general position with an interview with the Los Angeles Times in 1987, where he argued that putting down the protest was needed to allow for Shanghai's greater opening up to the world. And opened up Shanghai sure did. Jiang got approval to formally transition Shanghai to a market economy and did away with many regulations in the city. He also hired many competent subordinates to handle the day-to-day economics and management of the city so he could focus more on the government and political side of things. This gave him the opportunity to frequently meet with the many foreign visitors to Shanghai, which is now a common stop on foreign tours of China, and gave him some positive attention internationally. He also now had a free hand to talk about some political reforms, though very minor and vague, mainly giving speeches about how taboo opinions should be allowed to be voiced. The catalyst for national reforms, Hu Yaobang, died in 1989. Jiang was actually in attendance at the meeting where Hu had the first of a series of heart attacks that would kill him in April of that year. Hu Yaobang was the only major politician talking about serious political reforms and the opening of intellectual spaces. Gatherings and memorials for Hu quickly turned into protests in Beijing, which became huge protests in Shanghai when word spread there. Many people were outraged by how he was removed from power and the attempted censorship of his ideas. The protests in Shanghai weren't as big of a deal as what a certain newspaper was printing, that being the World Economic Herald. Considered the most reformist media outlet in the country, they were now openly publishing articles supporting Hu and slamming top leaders for ousting him from power. Jiang's initial response was to demand the paper vet all new articles with party censors in Shanghai. The editor of the paper refused, uncensored versions of the paper were printed, and the editor was nowhere to be found. The local party apparatus quickly made the paper be subservient to a 5-person review board, and Jiang fired the editor. This, considering what the response to these protests would famously culminate in, seems fairly minor and restrained. Zhao Ziyang, now the second most important person in the country, didn't think so and was furious. Zhao had a reputation as a reformer, and the World Economic Herald was one of his biggest sources of support, now essentially decapitated. Zhao criticized Jiang for his hasty decision, calling his solution simplistic. Jiang also had pressure from hardliners in the party, since his review board wasn't doing their jobs and were still letting anti-government articles through. This turned into a weeks-long battle, mostly Zhao and Jiang sending angry letters to each other, with Zhao on the attack and Jiang playing defense. Things weren't helped by Gorbachev's visit to China, in which Shanghai would be a stop. Jiang was barely able to rally enough police to clear Gorby's route of the estimated 100,000 protesters now in Shanghai. A few days later, Jiang was finally able to talk to most of the protesters, walking into the crowd with a megaphone, promising to hold talks and supporting the anti-corruption side of their protests. Back in Beijing, Zhao Ziyang tried a similar tactic, walking into Tiananmen Square and basically saying, "We're really sorry about this, can't you all go home?" When this didn't work, top leaders came back with a different plan, martial law. Surely, this would never come back to bite them. Soldiers tried to clear Beijing of protesters over several days, but were largely unsuccessful and only served to turn a few protesters to violence. Zhao became the protesters' newest target, and there were calls for him to step down. Deng Xiaoping's patience with his continued bungling of the protests was wearing thin, and he began exploring options for a replacement as general secretary. Deng convened a secret meeting with a few top officials on May 27th, where Jiang Zemin was selected to be the new general secretary after a few hours of debate. The decision came down to his relative youth, success with economic reforms, and being a fairly personable guy who could help with protests and similar discontent in the future. Most people were surprised and shocked by this choice, as was Jiang, who had no idea he was even up for consideration until a private meeting with Deng a few days later. He got acquainted with his new position for a few days, and boy, what days those were. These were the final days of the Beijing protests, culminating in the Tiananmen Square massacre. Jiang's role in the events of these days are hard to say. We pretty much only have anecdotal accounts. Some say he had no involvement, some say he was deeply involved. What we do know is he was generally against the heavy-handed response and pushed for police reform, preferring them to use non-lethal means for crowd control. Jiang was officially elected as General Secretary on June 28, 1989, around the same time Deng Xiaoping retired from politics, formally turning over the keys. People in China and internationally were surprised by this selection. He was a periphery politician at best, a liability at worst. Basically nobody thought his term would last long. One diplomat in Beijing said he would be running a transitional government at best, though many were hopeful. He was untainted by many of the scandals and issues of Beijing politics, and had shown his willingness to work with foreign countries throughout his career. Jiang immediately got to work on addressing a few basic concerns of the protesters, mainly on the corruption front. He tightened regulations on government officials, no more banquets, foreign cars, or big year-end bonuses. He also handled the response to foreign media about the Tiananmen incident in a major press conference where any question was allowed. He asserted that the soldiers only opened fire after they'd been attacked by protesters. He stressed that this was a one-off incident and it shouldn't dissuade foreign investment and interest in China. Overall, foreign media was very impressed with his demeanor. A Chinese leader taking questions from the press this openly was unheard of. He spent the rest of 1989 and 1990 bolstering domestic support, mainly making public visits to various mines, factories, and farms. He visited Kim Il-sung in North Korea, assuring each other they would work together to fend off the collapse of communism happening in Europe from spreading to Asia. Invited a few university students to Zhongnan High, that's nice. All in all, pretty typical stuff for a new leader to do. He still didn't really have a base, and was very dependent on the support and advice of Deng Xiaoping in these first years. 1992 saw one of Deng's last major political moves, his famous Southern Tour. Economic reforms had been curtailed by conservative elements in the government in the aftermath of Tiananmen, and foreign investors were scared off from China by the incident. Guangdong and Shenzhen in the south were still progressing with the reforms, and were the fastest growing regions in China as a result. Deng visited these areas and praised them for their progress, and spoke against those still against free market reform. While Jiang wasn't really a focus of anything he said, Jiang still interpreted many of his comments as criticizing him and moved towards more reform as a result. 1992 was mostly Jiang securing his position, or more accurately, Deng securing it for him. Deng got the military to fall in line and replaced many of the most conservative politicians with younger, reform-minded ones. Deng made a 20-minute-long speech in front of the National People's Congress supporting Jiang, crushing any doubt of him as Deng's formal successor. Jiang made a couple international trips, one to Japan and one to South Korea, after finally establishing diplomatic relations with the latter. This made Kim Il-sung mad, and his request for military material aid was rebuffed by Jiang that same year. Funny anecdote from this time, Jiang really liked to receive reports and talk directly with those who reported to him. Dr. Song Jian, a scientist and mathematician who worked in China's aerospace industry, was requested to just give him any articles or papers he found interesting. He'd just walk into Jiang's office and hand him some scientific documents every once in a while. Incredibly funny, this is how I'd run a government. By 1993, Jiang was very secure in his position and fairly popular as a leader. He began fulfilling some of his promises he made earlier, like police reform. The People's Armed Police, which were essentially cops with military gear before, were given proper riot control equipment. He also transferred many units from military authority to civilian police authority. Don't think he was some ACAB crusader, though. He also expanded the powers of the Ministry of State Security, China's intelligence and secret police agency. He allowed the MSS to spy on basically anyone they wanted without a warrant and had them report directly to him. Inflation and rising costs were a big problem at this time. China's economy was growing by 12% each year, by far the highest in the world. Costs, however, were increasing by about 40% each year for most goods and services. This was mainly curtailed by the amount of loans given out by the People's Bank of China, which slowed overall growth but prevented a huge inflation crisis. 1993 had quite a lot of diplomatic activity, with some back-channel talks between Jiang and the president of Taiwan via the US ambassador to China. He tried to get Beijing to host the 2000 Olympics, didn't work. Placated Britain about Hong Kong, who were suddenly freaking out about there being a new leader in Beijing. Got a container ship seized by the US for allegedly carrying chemical weapons, though none were ever found. I'm sure America will be very careful about making accusations like that in the future. 1994 was marked with continued austerity measures, now increasingly unpopular. Some conservatives in the government argued with Jiang that he should enforce Mao-style price controls to fix the immediate issue. While Jiang was deeply bothered by the inflation problem, he trusted Deng and allowed the free market to continue even if it had some short-term growing pains, knowing it would be beneficial for the country overall. He continued many of the military reforms started by Deng in the 80s and made a ton of visits to military academies and installations. Overall, he had a fairly hands-off approach to the military, as the first leader of the People's Republic without any military experience. China-US relations deteriorated quite a bit, with Jiang and Clinton exchanging heated remarks about each other's governments. Clinton demanded China improve their human rights situation, and Jiang accused America of trying to make China into a vassal. Things weren't going well with Britain either, as he tried to hastily renegotiate the exact terms for the return of Hong Kong to China scheduled to happen in 1997, and was very angry when the British rebuffed him. He did formally get the ball rolling on joining the World Trade Organization this year too. 1995 saw greater economic policy centralization, not to be confused with a return to a planned economy. It was common at this time for the government to draft a new policy and receive unanimous support from provincial governors, but with various explanations about how their particular province should be exempt. He personally met with every provincial governor and made them pledge to follow Beijing's policies, whatever they may be, with threats of dismissal if they refused. He also began taking greater control of the media, prohibiting foreign investment in Chinese media organizations and forbidding Chinese reporters from writing for foreign organizations. Media were also prohibited from reporting on negative phenomena such as protests or legal disputes. He gave a speech on Taiwan that would set the policy regarding that dispute for a while. Jiang softened the tone on Taiwan quite a bit, saying they would be allowed to retain their own government, military, and independent legal system in a hypothetical reunification. This speech made nobody happy. He threw in a vague military threat at the end, which made Taiwan nervous. The military and the rest of the government wasn't happy about Taiwan being given all these concessions. Dr. Sun Jian, his scientist friend, also formally made a proposal to the government this year for a program to advance science and education in the country. Jiang got this proposal pushed through the Politburo and pledged to end China's exam-based educational system. Yeah, that really worked out. China-US relations only got worse when the president of Taiwan visited America. Clinton had allegedly promised Jiang at a meeting in Moscow that the president wouldn't be allowed in, but the trip was approved anyway. Jiang felt betrayed and vocally condemned the US for this. Jiang stated privately to the military that the Taiwan independence movement is getting out of hand and to increase military readiness. This would lead to the third Taiwan Strait crisis, continuing into 1996. Tons of missile tests and naval exercises surrounded the island for months, leading to a fairly major economic downturn for Taiwan. Shipping costs exploded and the stock market crashed. It eventually died down, with China generally considered to have won the incident, coming out looking stronger than it entered, though it did allow that Taiwanese president to win a comfortable election victory during the crisis. He made a visit to the UN General Assembly, making a speech speaking against big powers who use the pretext of human rights to interfere with other countries. He met with Clinton on the sidelines, and the two of them talked for a bit and largely made up. 1996 saw some interesting messaging from Jiang. He gave speeches telling officials to focus on politics and increase cultural and moral fortitude. Jiang spoke about how China's cultural, spiritual, and moral aspects were falling behind its economic and material development. This was a strange turn to say the least, and worried many people. Talk like this was last heard during the Cultural Revolution. The ideas he put forth, what would be known as Jiang thought, encompassed a broad integration of the new free market thinking and system with old Marxist ideas of the country. More broadly, it was pushing back against Western culture that was increasingly intruding into China. This was just against the cultural side of Western influence. Western money and expertise was still more than welcome. An article in the People's Daily put it as, China shouldn't give up eating for fear of choking. Ultimately, this wasn't turned into concrete policy and was just a vague directive to improve morality and thinking. He visited a ton of countries in 1996, mainly in Africa, Central Asia, and Europe. Perhaps the most famous images of these trips were him very obviously combing his hair in front of the King of Spain. He did a brief tour around Asia, became the first modern Chinese leader to visit India, and sang Elvis Presley songs with the President of the Philippines. The two most important events of 1997 had to be the death of Deng Xiaoping and the return of Hong Kong to China. Deng Xiaoping's death was pretty inconsequential. His health had been declining for a few years, and everything was well prepared in advance. Jiang gave a 50-minute long speech at his funeral and took the opportunity to reinforce his political position. Recordings of Deng praising Jiang were rebroadcast on TV. A soundbite of Deng saying, "The choice of Jiang Zemin is correct," was frequently repeated. For Hong Kong, the handover was also very smooth and rehearsed, but not without some minor controversies. The head of the Hong Kong government, the position of governor, would be replaced by the position of chief executive. The first chief executive, Tung Chee-hwa, had been chosen by a 400-person committee rather than a direct election in Hong Kong as many were expecting. Prime Minister Tony Blair boycotted the handover ceremony as a result. 1997 also saw Jiang's first formal summit with the United States. This was a very extensive visit, going all over the country. Protests by various activist groups, human rights, Tibetan, and Taiwanese especially, were planning gatherings at every stop along the way. The trip was overall a success, with Jiang and Clinton making firm progress on a variety of issues. The two finally got along at a more personal level, with Jiang referring to Clinton as "my friend Bill Clinton" from now on. He took a few news interviews and answered plenty of unscripted questions at press conferences. 1998 was a fairly eventful year, some of the most notable events being an increase in foreign movies being allowed into China after the success of Titanic, a visit from Bill Clinton, and the elevation of Hu Jintao, who would eventually succeed Jiang as leader. India and Pakistan exchanged nuclear tests, increasing tension for a while in Asia. One of India's cited reasons for their test was the threat posed by China, which Jiang was apparently legitimately surprised and confused by. Some interesting military reforms happened this year regarding the military's influence in business. Due to budget cuts in the 80s, some parts of the military became involved in both legitimate and illegitimate business with surprisingly far reach. The PLA was operating everything from hotels to nightclubs to airlines to cell networks to professional basketball teams. They also participated in smuggling and bootlegging, particularly movies and software. Jiang had quite a bit of sway with the military now, and decreed that all such enterprises should be immediately broken up and dissolved. Top brass complied, but there were many grumblings from less senior officers. He further stretched his political capital with the military when he required their assistance in dealing with major flooding in the country that displaced more than 250 million people. Things were generally fine with both of these, though there were some minor protests in 1999 by workers who lost their jobs when their PLA employers had to shutter their businesses. These were hardly the protests of concern, however. On April 25th, over 10,000 members of a cult known as Falun Gong began encircling Zhongnanhai. With an estimated 2 million members, not much in terms of China's vast population, many top leaders had never even heard of the people surrounding the main government building in Beijing. This protest was over some Falun Gong members who had been arrested for protesting in front of a newspaper office that printed an article they believed was defamatory towards their sect. The protest was dispersed fairly easily after a spokesman was sent out to speak with them. He said the government had no dispute with them, but that they couldn't engage in this type of behavior. The protesters left very quickly after this. Jiang was enraged by this incident. It had come completely out of nowhere, and worse yet, it was revealed that there were party members among the protesters. Jiang also had a more personal grievance with the cult. A friend of his had joined for the meditation and exercise part of their beliefs, but died from a brain hemorrhage after she refused medical care due to the cult's prohibition against modern medicine. His response to Falun Gong would have to wait, as a much more important event in May captured national attention: the NATO bombing of the Chinese embassy in Serbia. This was part of the broader NATO air campaign against Serbia, where an American B-2 Spirit dropped bombs on the Chinese embassy, killing 3 people and injuring dozens more. The incident is still pretty confusing to say the least. The CIA, who organized the attack, claimed it was a mere mistake, which seems hard to believe given the precision bombs used. On the other hand, there's not really a benefit to attacking a random Chinese embassy. Jiang did get a lick in on Falun Gong with it, joking that if Falun Gong masters can predict the future, why couldn't they predict the attack on our embassy? Huge anti-American protests broke out around China, snarling many of Jiang's reforms. His opening up to the West now seemed much less appealing to many people, and his bid to join the World Trade Organization was put on hold. Rocks were thrown at the US Embassy in Beijing, and consulates were surrounded. Very strong statements against America and NATO were put up by various government organs. The protests wore on for about a week before the government finally intervened to halt them. Jiang finally accepted a phone call from Clinton after declining them for the entire week. Attention of the government quickly turned back to Falun Gong, who had restrictions placed on them, and in practice it was a total ban. It was now illegal to have gatherings, spread cult materials, or to demonstrate for the cult. An arrest warrant was also put out for Li Hongzhi, the leader of the cult, who had left the country prior. Falun Gong's response was to claim they had been responsible for the NATO bombing of the Chinese embassy using their leader's supposed supernatural abilities. I'm not kidding. But for now, the ban elicited some critical comments about the government, but it didn't have too many consequences. 2000 had some big policy changes, including the implementation of Jiang Zemin's 3 represents theory. This was essentially a plan to modernize Marxism. The 3 things to represent with this policy are advanced productive forces, advanced culture, and the interests of the Chinese people. This whole thing sounds kind of strange in English. I mean, the name of it sounds like something from a bad sci-fi book, but it makes more sense in Chinese. The long and short of it is that it was an attempt to update China's Marxist rhetoric and culture to incorporate the new economic realities and wealth now sweeping the nation. He focused again on education reform in 2000, setting a goal of China being one of the top 10 countries for science by 2010. Jiang even got to write a couple pieces for the journal Science, an honor not usually afforded to national leaders. 2000 saw two of his most famous moments on camera, the first being an interview with Mike Wallace of 60 Minutes. It's quite the interview, it's on YouTube if you want to watch it. Wallace didn't hold back with his questions, and Jiang fired back with a few tough questions of his own. The interview left many in America with a good impression of Jiang, even if the editing and translation choices for some of his comments were a little inaccurate, to say the least.
I'm wagging my finger at the president of China.
The other media incident happened a few weeks later at a press conference in Beijing. Jiang blew up at some reporters from Hong Kong after one asked if his endorsement of Teng Chihua's re-election campaign was an imperial appointment. The result was... I'll let you watch for yourself. If you've seen any video of Jiang Zemin, this is probably the clip you've seen.
说起西方这一套的魅力，你们毕竟还图一样，明白这意思吧？我告诉你们，我是身经百战了，见得多了。西方的哪个国家我没去过？你们有一个好，全世界跑到什么地方，你们比其他的西方知道，跑得还快。但是呢，问来问去的问题啊，都 too simple。sometimes naive。今天是作为一个长者。 给你们讲讲，我不是新闻工作者，但是我见的太多了，说我有这个必要好告诉你们一点人生的经验。你们啊，naive.
Absolutely amazing. Ultimately, these two events didn't really matter much, but Jiang got a couple vague criticisms from Politburo members about how politicians should show decorum. 2001 was a low point in US-China relations, with a change in leadership in America and the Hainan Island incident. The US flew, and still flies, reconnaissance flights in international waters but near the Chinese coast quite frequently. China typically responds with fighters to intercept the plane, keeping a safe distance. It's this weird sort of diplomatic dance, but it's a pretty common phenomenon. On April 1st, 2001, a US Navy EP-3 signal intelligence plane was conducting one of these patrols near the island of Hainan. Two Chinese J-8 fighters were sent to intercept and monitor the American aircraft. It isn't clear what exactly happened, but one of the fighters and the American plane collided with each other, crashing the fighter into the sea and the death of its pilot, and forcing the American plane to land on Hainan. The new American president, George W. Bush, demanded China not tamper with or board the downed plane, claiming it had sovereign immunity. That worked about as well as those sovereign citizen license plates. Jiang blamed the US for the incident and demanded an official apology. He also ordered a huge search and rescue operation for the downed pilot to no avail, sadly. The US was reluctant to issue an apology, seeing their plane as having done nothing more than make an emergency landing. China allowed American diplomats to visit the crew of the plane, confirming their well-being. The crew was held in China for 10 days, when they were freed by an official apology from the State Department for the incident. The plane was eventually returned to the US as well, though after it had been completely disassembled and analyzed by Chinese engineers. In happier news, Beijing won its bid to host the 2008 Olympics in July of that year, and good news for people who like cheap products but bad news for anyone outside of China with a manufacturing job, China also joined the World Trade Organization that year. Jiang and Bush didn't get along for the first few months of his term, but they reconciled after Jiang supported America after 9/11. They held a summit in Shanghai, where Jiang firmly threw China's support behind the US anti-terrorism effort. This was partially to get a free hand to combat terrorism within China, particularly in Xinjiang, where Chinese anti-terror efforts have been criticized as heavy-handed before. Jiang's time as leader was coming to an end, and it was time to elevate a successor. He chose a rather obscure politician, Hu Jintao. Hu was the governor of Tibet for a time, and was generally considered a fairly middle-of-the-road, reliable technocrat, sort of like Jiang. He was a pretty low-profile, respected, safe choice. There were actually many who wanted Jiang to remain as leader, beyond his allocated term, particularly from the military, surprisingly. Jiang rejected these requests, stating how he thought it was important for China to have a younger leader. 2002, the last full year of Jiang's leadership, was pretty uneventful. Mainly his time was spent dealing with the boring internal politics of the changing leaders with a few minor international trips. He got some of his ideas, most notably the 3 represents, written into the Constitution. He stayed on as chairman of the Central Military Commission until 2004, but his leadership was de facto over at the end of 2002. It was all rather unceremonious and abrupt, mostly done behind the scenes, as is typical in Chinese history. Though Jiang's political career was not over even in retirement, he kept a modicum of influence through a group of politicians known generally as the Shanghai Clique or Shanghai Gang. I don't want to get too into the weeds on this. Trying to guess the inner workings of the Politburo in the last 30 years is basically impossible. You're better off consulting a magic 8-ball than some of these articles written about it, I swear. The TLDR is the Shanghai gang was a bunch of Jiang's friends who stayed on after he retired, some notable members being Zhou Yongkang and Wang Huning. They had some minor clashes with Hu Jintao, and the gang was generally broken up under Xi Jinping. What precisely they did and affected is anyone's guess. Jiang kept a fairly low profile in retirement, appearing occasionally at events and on holidays mainly. But he kept a very high profile in the minds of many Chinese people through the greatest internet meme of all, toad culture. You can't talk about Jiang Zemin without at least mentioning toad culture. Started as a joke about Jiang's demeanor and somewhat toad-like appearance, it morphed into a strange sort of counterculture. Hu Jintao and Xi Jinping's terms both saw severe curtailments of personal liberties and rights in China, creating a longing for the more hands-off era of Jiang Zemin. There's a ton of specific memes and jokes as part of toad culture. Some of my favorites are repeating some of Jiang's more ridiculous quotes like, too simple, sometimes naive. True fans will always recognize him as another good one, regarding images that have a vague resemblance to Jiang. Some other miscellaneous memes include referring to him as the Elder and +1 second, wishing a long life to Jiang. But, as we all must learn, internet points don't matter much in real life, and Jiang Zemin passed away on November 30th, 2022, at the age of 96. He was just a kid. Jiang Zemin was quite the guy, both as a person and as a leader. He oversaw China's meteoric rise in both economic terms, but also in scientific, cultural, and military terms. While certainly not without scandal and controversy, he's remembered as a steady hand and as a personable guy. He navigated crisis and instability, and integrated Western-style capitalism with Chinese-style Marxism. His moderation and wisdom saw China through a period that could have been incredibly destabilizing and dangerous. He's remembered for the relative freedom and openness of his time, when the Chinese political sphere was full of hope and progress, rather than the tensions of the modern era.